Welcome, everyone. This webinar is presented by the PBCers and the Northeast Ohio Liver Alliance. The webcast was made possible by an unrestricted educational grant from Intercept Pharmaceuticals. Intercept does not control or direct the material, presentations, or speakers, and this webcast is not being done by either party to influence medical treatment decisions. The PBCers organization is the online and in-person support group for people with primary biliary cholangitis, care partners, and healthcare team members. We established as a 501c3 nonprofit in 1996. We are your go-to resource for peer support and up-to-date accurate information on PBC.
Thanks, Carol. We are the Northeast Ohio Liver Alliance. It's a nonprofit organization founded in 2021 to educate healthcare professionals and laypersons about liver disease, advocate for resources, policy change, and public health interventions that prevent and positively impact liver disease. Support research and public health interventions that benefit persons living with liver disease. The information in this webinar is not a substitute for advice given by your physician or any healthcare provider. We do not endorse any doctor, hospital, medical group, or treatment.
I'd like to introduce you to our three speakers tonight. First is Dr. John Vierling. Dr. Vierling is located in Houston, Texas. His transitional research interest is in immunological mechanisms of biliary injury in multiple liver diseases, including autoimmune diseases. He has been past president of the American Association for the Study of Liver Diseases, Secretary Treasurer of Digestive Disease Week, and former chairman of the National Board of Directors of the American Liver Foundation. His goal is to advance the science and practice of hepatology. John has also been a part of the PBCers since we were in our beginning stages. He's a longtime friend of ours. Next up after that, we will have Dr. Dian Chiang. He's the section head of hepatology at Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. His clinical and research interests include novel therapeutic targets in primary biliary cirrhosis or cholangitis and prevention of complications of cirrhosis and quality improvement for liver elastography. He has developed a PBC database in the Cleveland Clinic and conducted novel investigator-initiated studies, as well as clinical trials to advance PBC treatment. He serves on the medical board, advisory board for both Ipsen and Gilead Sciences. Next is Rachel Kilian. She's currently the Vice President of Advocacy at Intercept Pharmaceuticals. She has expertise in a wide of biotech and pharmaceutical development over the last 20 years, from benchtop research and development through product launches, and found her home in advocacy work. She holds an MS in molecular biology, a PhD in clinical investigation, and lectures at the University of Colorado Graduate School on clinical outcomes. Here's a few notes. You will notice the chat is disabled. Please use the Q&A section to ask questions throughout the webinar. The questions will be answered in the order received. However, if there's a question that you see listed that you'd like to make sure it gets answered, you can upvote by clicking the thumbs up button. Next, will be Rachel.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Rachel.
Thanks, Carol. I just want to anchor us all in why we're here tonight. So as just for a reference point, following requests from the FDA, Intercept made the difficult decision to voluntarily withdraw Ocaliva from the US market for PBC. We continue to believe in the totality of clinical and real-world evidence that supports Ocaliva's use for appropriate patients. Important date to note is that Ocaliva will no longer be available for prescription after November 14th. And from the bottom of my heart and from the bottom that everyone's heart that works at Intercept, this withdrawal doesn't change Intercept's commitment to patients and our commitment to patients during this transition stage. And so we're constantly updating our website with FAQs and resourcing available. So just want to say thank you for being here tonight, and thank you for learning. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Vierling.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you, Carol. Already introduced me, and my passion has been in investigating the mechanisms that underlie multiple liver diseases, which are inflammatory. And that, of course, includes PBC, which is a disease I've had the pleasure of working with patients and families and investigators now for almost 4 decades. I do have disclosures that are listed here, but I believe none of them conflict with my ability to give you an unbiased presentation. In fact, most of them relate to the fact that I've been quite active in the field.
Yep.
So my intent is to go through some highlights that relate to the therapy and the ability to track the status of primary biliary cholangitis for individual patients. And when we talk about therapy, we must begin with the fact that there is a primary treatment which is recommended by all professionals and all professional societies, and that's ursodeoxycholic acid, abbreviated as UDCA. It has a very particular dose range, which is important for its treatment efficiency and effect, which is 13 to 15 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day. It improves a variety of biochemistries. It's shown at the 12 o'clock position of the cartoon on the left. It improves cholesterol and IgM concentrations. It delays histological progression, meaning the progress of fibrosis, the scarring reaction of the liver. It delays development of esophageal varices as a consequence of portal hypertension, and improves liver transplant-free survival. So it does all the right things. The data that support it doing all of those things is shown on the graph to the right, and just circled in the little, kind of blue-green box is the fact that UDCA has this sort of superiority with respect to all parameters that are investigated in studies that look at different age groups. They look at different biochemical levels of abnormality for bilirubin and for alkaline phosphatase. So it is the scientific underpinning of why this is recommended. Okay. Now, many of you are aware that the approval of drugs for the treatment of PBC, specifically second-line therapies to be added to ursodeoxycholic acid as the baseline foundational first-line therapy, have been approved on the basis of their ability to change the blood test results. And those blood test results, the change that was being looked for was to reduce the alkaline phosphatase, abbreviated ALP, to less than 1.67 times the upper limit of normal, which is roughly 200 for most laboratory ranges, and to keep the bilirubin within the normal range, no higher than 1.0 milligrams per deciliter. We now know that there are better surrogates based on outcome studies from very large databases of patients with PBC who are being treated. The better surrogates estimate survival based on alkaline phosphatase reduction, not to just 1.67, but actually into the normal range shown in that orange graph over about a 15-year period, as compared to the range that was the previous target for clinical trial design, shown in the blue-green at 1 to 1.67 times the upper limit of normal. Lower is better. Normal is better. Now, on the right, we had just told you that having the bilirubin in the normal range to be less than 1.0 is good, but having it less than 0.6 times the upper limit of normal, which is essentially 0.6 milligrams per deciliter in blue, has the highest survival advantage. Bilirubin that's within the normal range is the next highest, that's shown in green. And bilirubin above the normal range has always been known to be a risk factor. So we want to have the idea implanted that as we move forward with therapies, we're increasingly going to be targeting these more advantageous endpoints of normalization of ALP and keeping bilirubin less than 0.6. This slide illustrates that when we assess the use of UDCA after 12 months of full use, that one has the ability to note that about 60% are responders based on lowering the alkaline phosphatase to between 1 and 1.67 times the upper limit of normal and having a normal bilirubin. And we know that they have reduced liver-related deaths and need for liver transplantation, so that it is of benefit. But as you see on the right, 40% do not meet those treatment goals. And that means that they are at risk of progression to cirrhosis if they do not have the cirrhosis, or if they have cirrhosis, progression of it to a more advanced state with portal hypertension or hepatocellular carcinoma, and then an earlier death if not rescued with a life-saving liver transplant. Now, the symptoms, of course, are independent of these sort of outcomes, but the symptoms are important to every patient. And we know that pruritus and fatigue dominate the symptoms, but also that other autoimmune diseases themselves cause symptoms, and autoimmune diseases such as PBC are always prone to having more than one autoimmune disease. This gets into the treatment phase of my comments, and we're starting with obeticholic acid, or Ocaliva. It's modified bile acid, and it's a potent agonist, meaning a stimulant of the FXR nuclear factor. That was the goal of its manufacture and its design. And that modified bile acid, obeticholic acid, has many effects once it stimulates gene expression through this nuclear receptor of FXR. That includes the ability to decrease the fibrosis and scarring of the liver, to substantially decrease the inflammation of the liver, and to change the bile acids so that a person does not have such retention of potentially toxic bile acids that we call cholestasis. Cola meaning bile in Greek, and stasis meaning a stasis of the bile, kind of then damaging potentially the hepatocytes or the cholangiocytes. The next on the list of compounds you're also probably aware of are the peroxisome proliferator activated receptor agents. So that's a mouthful. So we just call them PBCers for short. And they stimulate biologically important receptors that also turn on genes within cells. And those receptors are the delta, alpha, and gamma receptor. Now, each of those receptors has consequences, and you can see the delta receptor influences cholestasis, this retention of toxic bile acids. It influences lipids such as cholesterol. It influences glucose metabolism, inflammation, and fibrosis. The alpha receptor is much more dominated by its effects on cholestasis and lipids. And in fact, the original alpha receptor agonist called fenofibrate was approved for the treatment of elevated lipids in the United States some decades ago. The gamma receptor has principal effects on glucose and fibrosis. Below it is a table listing the kinds of agents that are PBCers. At the top of the list is bezafibrate, which has activity for all three receptors. So we call this a pan-PBCer agent. Now, this agent is unavailable in the US. It does have some availability in Canada, and certainly quite available in Europe. Next shown in this duality in the order in which they were FDA approved is elafibranor, which has the ability to stimulate the alpha and the delta receptors. The seladelpar, which is exclusively a delta receptor stimulant. Seraglitazar is, again, like bezafibrate in that it stimulates all three receptors, and it is in a phase 2b study, moving potentially to phase 3 in PBC. And then we have fenofibrate, which I've mentioned was the one FDA approved decades ago, which was FDA approved for the treatment of lipids. And I put this on the list because it has been used by clinicians in an off-label use, assuming that a PPAR could potentially benefit a patient with PBC. So what is the basis of all of this? What are the kinds of outcomes of using these different PPAR agents as second-line therapies added to that baseline ursodeoxycholic acid? This starts with the elafibranor trial that led to its approval this past year. It was a randomized, placebo-controlled phase 3 trial. The patients were adults aged 18 to 75. They had had urso treatment for at least 12 months, but most had had it for years. The alkaline phosphatase had to be above the endpoint determinant of 1.67 times the upper limit of normal. The bilirubin can be as high as twice the upper limit of normal, and they had to have no evidence of clinically significant decompensation. That did not mean they couldn't have cirrhosis. About 12 to 14% did, but they could not have decompensated cirrhosis. Now, the primary endpoints that led to the approval by the FDA of this for general use are shown in the bottom panels. Elafibranor met its primary endpoint, which was to reduce alkaline phosphatase to lower than 1.67 to remove the bilirubin and maintain it in the normal range. And you can see that happened in a 51% of the elafibranor patients compared to 4% of the placebo patients, a very highly statistically different difference. When you look to the next panel over, you see that ALP at 12 months was normalized in 15% of the patients that were taking the drug, but none of the patients in the placebo group. An assessment of patients who had a 78-week double-blind visit showed maintenance of the biochemical response and other improvements in liver chemistry, so that it was long-term of benefit, not just at 12 months. And in the bottom right, we see adverse events that were occurring more frequently with elafibranor than in the placebo-treated patients. And you can see the columns related to the frequency of abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting. Now, because the placebo patients were a number of patients, twice as many were enrolled in elafibranor, you want to pay attention when looking at this comparison to what's in parentheses, because that's the percentage, not the raw number. So it looks like that a lot more people had these like abdominal pain with elafibranor, but there was twice as many patients in the group. It was really only 11%. So this is a summary of data that published in the New England Journal of Medicine, subsequently locked out of the database and reanalyzed with the FDA that led to approval. This part of the study was a key secondary endpoint, and that was itch, pruritus. When you look at the left, you see in the gray the itch scores of the placebo group, and in orange, the itch scores of the group treated with elafibranor. And this change, as you can see, separates the lines slightly, but there's great overlap in terms of the confidence intervals around those lines, and there was no significant difference in this key secondary endpoint. An analysis was then done of itch-related items scored in a different fashion, and that was using a patient-derived scoring system of PBC40, which has an itch domain, and these patients had moderate to severe pruritus at baseline. And in this particular study, they found that there, again, was no significant difference between elafibranor and placebo. So it did not meet its secondary endpoint for itch. Let's look next at what was approved in the same year, but several months later, and that's seladelpar. This is the PPAR delta-only agonist. And this was a randomized placebo-controlled phase 3 trial. It used the exact same endpoint as the elafibranor study, which is the exact same endpoint that was used for the obeticholic acid study. And that's the alkaline phosphatase reducing to less than 1.67 and having a normal bilirubin. In the bottom left, you see that that endpoint was met in 61.7% of patients, 62%, and it was met in 20% of placebo patients. The next panel over shows that normalization of alkaline phosphatase occurred in 25% of treated patients and none of the patients in the placebo group. Now, like the elafibranor study, this study had an open enrollment study that followed it, where about 96% of patients in the study elected to sign a new informed consent and go into an open label where everybody was treated and no one was in a placebo group. And that study is called ASSURE. That is an interim efficacy analysis in that study have shown maintenance of the biochemical response and other improvements in liver chemistries and pruritus through 2 years. So again, just like elafibranor, there are data that patients continue to benefit. It's not something limited to the first 12 months of their therapy. Now, the adverse events occurring more frequently with seladelpar than placebo are illustrated in this table. It's organized the same way as the prior table with elafibranor. And I call your attention to the parentheses, which have the percentage of the patients. So that's the comparative number. And one could see that it was conducted during the COVID era. So it's not surprising that COVID infections occurred within patients in the study. Headache, abdominal pain, nausea, and abdominal distension were all things that occurred in more than 5% of the patients. This looks at seladelpar and its significant effect on pruritus using a numerical rating score, an NRS score. What is that? Well, this is the score that I didn't describe back with elafibranor, but it's the same scoring system that is used by regulatory authorities, not much used by clinicians. It ranges from 0, meaning no itch, to a person's self-description of a 10 being the worst itch imaginable that they can ever conceive of. And so at baseline, 1/3 of the patients had scores to characterize them as having moderate to severe itch. Those are scores of 4 or more on the scale 0 to 10. Among these patients, the average NRS score was actually ranging between 6.1 and 6.6, depending upon whether they were in the treatment or placebo group. Now, the bottom left panel shows the change in this NRS score, just as I showed you a graph of the same data in the elafibranor study. This study, you see, is separating the lines to a greater degree, starting very early on, around month 1 to 2. And then the defined point of analysis in the protocol was at 6 months. And at that point, there was a statistically significant difference showing improvement in itch in the seladelpar treated patients compared to placebo. Now, that was in the group with the high itch scores, the moderate to severe group. What if you put the data together for all patients? Because itch was occurring in about 70% of all patients, and you get the right graph, looking again at liver the differences in the NRS score. And that was an analysis that was not built into the protocol. So although it's highly separating and shows you the same kind of information, it's not really part of the analysis of the secondary endpoint. This looks at bezafibrate that I'd mentioned being available in Europe. It was a randomized controlled trial that put it on the map, and that trial was conducted exclusively in France. They had 100 PBC patients, randomizing to 400 milligrams per day or a placebo for 2 years. They had a primary endpoint that was much more robust and quite different than any that I've shared with you. It was complete normalization of all liver tests. And what they found, and it's shown in the graphs to the left, is that the complete normalization of all liver tests occurred in 30% of patients treated with bezafibrate and none of the patients in the placebo group. And when you look specifically at alkaline phosphatase, 2/3 of the bezafibrate group normalized their alkaline phosphatase, which again, I'll hark back to our newest analyses, suggest that that is perhaps the most, one of the strongest endpoints for long-term benefit and long-term outcome of patients. The secondary endpoint was a pruritus score. They also had some liver stiffness measurements and some enhanced liver fibrosis scoring. And all of these three things improved in the bezafibrate group. However, they did have some drug-induced liver injury, which is not unexpected in a pan-PPAR agent. It was not limiting to the trial, but for the individuals that suffered that injury, of course, it was an important event. Now, I'd like to address what I had in my initial table of the PPARs, and that is an off-label use of fenofibrate, which is a PPAR alpha only agonist. And that relates to the issues that we need to be aware of. Next, can you back up? And that is the risk of drug-induced liver injury, abbreviated DILI, as well as other AEs. Liver Tox is a clinical and research information on drug-induced liver injury website run by the FDA. And they have given a likelihood score of B to fenofibrate as a culprit in inducing drug-induced liver injury, which means it is a very likely cause of clinically apparent liver injury. And one can see in the yellow that there are a variety of informations available on that website that document that very fact. This also looks at this off-label use and talks about the FDA approval of the treatment for hyperlipidemia, elevated cholesterol triglyceride. And the FDA package insert of the drug contains what I've highlighted in yellow. It is saying patients with active liver disease, including those with the old terminology now of primary biliary cirrhosis, meaning PBC patients, and unexplained persistent liver function abnormalities, and patients with pre-existing gallbladder disease should not take the drug. So this is what the package insert says about the drug. Now, the pruritus is so intense for many patients and such a dominant symptom, and is obviously related because it happens more in the late afternoon and night, disturbing sleep and causing sleep deprivation and contributing significantly to fatigue during the day, that I added this slide about the production and recirculation of bile acids and the abilities we now have with FDA-approved agents for pediatric conditions to inhibit the gut's ability to reabsorb the bile acids from the gut. And this is becoming a new target of therapy for itch. And we have in this cartoon, boxed in the orange, that this enero, meaning gut, and hepatic, meaning liver, the gut-liver circulation of bile acids undergoes 8 to 10 cycles in all of us that are attending this webinar per day. And that means as they come down, they're absorbed, and they're absorbed in the ileum, which is the part of the small intestine that is just before it enters the colon. These then come back to the liver, they're taken up, they're taken back out through the liver to bile, and they recirculate. So there are ileal bile acid transport inhibitors that his class is called IBATs. And they have been FDA approved for pruritus in genetic cholestatic liver diseases that include Alagille syndrome for 2 of them, and the PFIC syndromes, which are genetic syndromes of cholestasis, for 1 of them. And they are also in clinical trials for the treatment of itch in patients with PBC. And we do not know the trial results as yet. The trials are incomplete, but there's great anticipation that they may be providing us new opportunities to silence itch in patients with PBC. I believe this is the last slide that I'm going to share with you. And this is asking a different type of question. And that is, what is the stage of an individual patient's disease? How much scarring does an individual patient have? Because we cannot really determine that from the levels of blood test results. We do have non-invasive measures, and this is one of them, which is a form of elastography. It's an ultrasound-based, therefore non-invasive, not painful, very easily performed test. And this transient elastography in the form of a FibroScan, which is vibration-controlled transient elastography, has been greatly studied in PBC. And it's been studied in many other liver diseases. And it's an FDA-approved test for overall assessment of fibrosis, meaning the scarring stage in an individual patient's liver, regardless of the disease they have. So I've highlighted here for PBC some of the actual values that are important to clinicians. And the current guidance that we have is that we consider that severe fibrosis moving toward stages 3 and cirrhosis as stage 4 are going to be for patients that have the liver stiffness measurements greater than essentially 11. And cirrhosis is right around, for this particular disease, 17. You can see it's compared to hepatitis C patients, much higher in terms of the stiffness measurement. But my point is not the detail. My point is to say there is availability of testing that is not based on liver biopsy that can help you as a patient and help your clinician understand what stage of fibrosis you have. And I think that that is something that needs to be increasingly appreciated, because we do not use liver biopsy much in the diagnosis of PBC. Therefore, almost every diagnosed patient, as we have modern, if they had a modern diagnosis, a recent diagnosis without a biopsy, they don't know what stage they are. And I think people are curious about that. That's why I wanted to give you this information. So I thank you for your attention to my remarks, and I want to turn this over to Dr. Chiang, who you already heard is the section head of hepatology at the Cleveland Clinic. He also has disclosures that are listed here. And Dr. Chiang, we await your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vierling, for your introduction and for the excellent presentation about the therapies available for PBC. I'm here to give people an overview of how I coach or help my patients go through this transition period. I'm sure many of you are concerned or have questions as we go through this transition. I hope I will share with you some of the key discussion points I have with my patients, the questions I encourage them to ask, and hopefully those will help you in your discussion with your physician or caregiver. And I would just start with 3 S that I think is most important for people to keep in mind when they discuss with their patients. The first S is symptoms. What are the symptoms I have in my PBC? I think that's the question that we should discuss with our physician or caregiver. The second S is stage. What is the stage of my disease? As Dr. Vierling mentioned in the presentation, the stage of fibrosis is very critical in how we assess the progression of the disease, as well as how we treat this condition. And the third S would be a systemic approach. Treating PBC is not only prescribing medication, even though it is a very important part of it, but beyond medication, what are the systemic approach that we should consider to help take care of this disease and keep it in remission? So those are the 3 S that I think are important for people to discuss with their physician as they see them for follow-up. So the first thing that I would ask people to do, and that's what I ask all my patients to do, is to set up a follow-up appointment so that we can discuss this together and decide what will be the best alternative option for you as we go through this transition. As Dr. Vierling mentioned, there are different alternatives available. Some may be better than others for certain individual, and that's a discussion that only a physician who knows you, who can look at a comprehensive assessment, including laboratory values, including imaging tests, including clinical symptoms, to come to a comprehensive assessment and come to a conclusion of recommendation. So those are the things that I ask all my patients to do. And once you are in the clinic, then the 3S, the symptoms, the stage of disease, and the systemic approach are the three things you can keep in mind in your discussion with your physician or caregiver so that they can help you make the most appropriate decision. So those are my recommendations for my patients, and I hope that will be helpful to you as you discuss this with your physician as well. So I will turn this over to Mark to help us get into the Q&A session.
Thanks, Dr. Chiang. Thank you, Dr. Vierling, as well, for your very informative presentation and remarks. Some of the questions that have been asked regarding the voluntary withdrawal of Ocaliva, people are scared to a certain degree, apprehensive, asking if they should stop their medication immediately just because it's been taken off the market. Should they stop taking it? Do you guys have any comments on that?
Well, perhaps I can lead off. And this is not the way to think about this voluntary withdrawal. This drug has been proven to be safe and effective when used for its appropriate indications. And anyone who has taken it, especially long-term, and benefited from it, they know that. That has not changed. This withdrawal has nothing to do with its safety profile or its effectiveness. It has everything to do with the laws that govern what happens to a drug that is initially approved, in this case back in 2016 for obeticholic acid, using the accelerated approval pathway. That pathway gives you the FDA approval, and that's what's benefited all of you that are on the drug. You've had that approval. It's an FDA-approved drug. Your insurer should be covering it as such. CMS, in terms of Medicaid and Medicare, does so. So that is fine. However, in that accelerated approval pathway is a stipulation that the drug subsequently has to have a randomized controlled trial that includes a placebo group where it is documented that patients taking the drug live longer, have less liver-related events, less need for transplantation, and develop fewer complications of chronic liver disease. And the issue there is one that I think we can all appreciate. If you're in the placebo group, you are basically signing up for a study that says you shouldn't take anything and definitely shouldn't go into one of the future trials, which I've shared with you in this after obeticholic acid would have included the elafibranor or the seladelpar trial. You're to sit tight so that you can show that you're going to do worse than people in the long-term treatment of obeticholic acid. I, for one, have a number of opinions about that, but it's not about my opinion about that. That is the regulation. And what happened is the trial fell apart that they were doing, called the Cobalt study, because people in the placebo group left the trial. They left the trial to achieve the treatment, or they left the trial to enroll in other studies that were being conducted. And once that happened, there was no ability of that trial to ever be successful. And it's the inability of that trial to be successful that triggered the European Medical Authority on the first round, and then subsequently the FDA, to say you're never going to get a full approval for use. It's futile. Your trial cannot achieve that goal. That's the status. So make no mistake, this is a safe and effective drug. And you're that are taking it, you know that. This withdrawal has nothing to do with that. This withdrawal has to do with the fact that this can never achieve the formal, full approval status because the trial to do so cannot be conducted.
Yeah, I would just echo what Dr. Vierling has mentioned. Specifically for patients who are currently on the medication, they are closely monitored by their physician, either through lab work as well as imaging studies and clinical visit to make sure they're tolerating the medication and make sure they are responding to the medication. Therefore, there should not be safety concerns for those who are being closely monitored. And I do echo also that for those who are responding, there is benefit based on the data that we see. That being said, again, the FDA's decision is based on the criteria that's set forth for medication gone through accelerated approval. So we can understand that. And what we want to do now is to help people transition to the alternative treatment.
Correct.
Mark,
Mark,
I
you're
think you're
muted.
muted.
Sorry, thank you. I do have another question that was put into the Q&A regarding patients seeing their hepatologist. Now that there's a transition, there's a change that's happening, what type of questions do they need to ask their physician when they see them?
I think
Dr.
I
Chang,
can
if you
start.
could, if you could chime in, thank you.
Sure. So I think number one is to ask what are the symptoms that I currently have that's related to my PBC and what can I do about it? Number two is what are the current stage of my disease, specifically the stage of fibrosis of my liver. And number three will be what will be the best alternative for me in terms of treating the disease and a systemic or comprehensive approach to all my other symptoms that's resulted from PBC. Those are, I think, the three questions people should ask their physicians when they see them.
Very good. This would be open to the panel. Are there patient support programs that are available and out there for patients during this transition? Rachel, maybe you would be able to chime in on that.
Yeah, I can chime in on here. We're doing a lot of things from the Intercept side. Every patient that is on Ocaliva should have gotten a letter of communication letting them know about the withdrawal. The same thing for all physicians that prescribe Ocaliva should also have gotten a note so that when patients are reaching out to make up their follow-up appointments, their doctor should know to expect them and that this is what's happening. We're also updating the website and working with patient advocacy groups to develop their own FAQs. There's also FAQs about the withdrawal that are on Intercept's site. And Interconnect, which is Intercept's patient support services, are also available by phone with an actual person so that you can ask additional questions about the withdrawal, insurance, and answer any other outstanding questions that you have. So that's from the Intercept side.
Very good. Thank you. The next question is regarding any type of lapse in treatment. If there is a delay or a lapse in treatment from moving to one medication to another medication, is that something that patients would need to reach out to their hepatologist? Would they be able to reach out to the pharmaceutical companies to allow any type of grace period? Is there an opportunity for that, or should it be something that is specifically followed up with their doctor to monitor lab values and so forth, is what you had mentioned, Dr. Chang?
I can start. I would say number one, the medication would remain on the market until November 14. And I would encourage every patient who are currently taking the medication to reach out to their physician's office right away. Many of the physicians who are seeing patients with PBC are already reaching out to their patients as well. But I can say from my experience, a lot of times it will take weeks to actually get hold of the patient and set up an appointment to discuss this. So if you are watching this tonight, I would encourage you to reach out to your physician as well. and to have a conversation about what do I need to do even before the clinic appointment. Sometimes it may be to get an updated lab work or get an updated elastography so that your physician can make a decision when they see you in the office. And that should be done as soon as possible. In some circumstances, the physician may have a recommendation for you based on your prior lab work data and imaging data, and they may be able to start that process of prior authorization for a certain medication. That's also a possible scenario. Each individual may be different, so I encourage you to have this conversation with your physician as soon as possible.
Very good.
I would underscore that also. And may I add that both companies, Ipsen, that manufactures the FDA-approved elafibranor, and Gilead, that manufactures the FDA-approved seladelpar, are quite aware of how devastating this news has been to those that have taken obeticholic acid long term. And they, by being aware, they have been kind of intensely focused on being able to respond to requests for new prescriptions and their authorization. Both companies have embedded programs that help physicians and their patients acquire their prescriptions, acquire the authorization for payment from insurers. So they are ready to do so. That, however, the choice between the two really needs to be, as Dr. Chiang said, a discussion that individualizes the choice that the individual patients need in consultation with their specific physician.
Thank you, Dr. Vierling. One of the other questions that was put in there was regarding a transition off of Ocaliva. Is there a period of time that is necessary for people to transition off of Ocaliva, whether they titrate it down, or is it, after the date that you had mentioned, Dr. Chiang, is it a cold turkey type of situation where they would just stop the medication and hopefully be able to see their hepatologist in the meantime to be able to work towards another treatment if that's what the choice is?
Well, I can, come in with part of the answer. I'm interested in Dr. Chiang's opinion. The way in which these drugs are used on a daily basis means that you could take today's dose, and were you to start a different drug, stop it and never take it again, and tomorrow take the new drug. It's really quite simple. You need no washout period. And what we would like to achieve is that transition that is seamless, so that when you stop one drug, you can then start the other. Now, that may not always be possible, but I want people to not be overly frightened if there was some type of minimal gap where you didn't have the drug for several days before you could start a new drug, because this disease and the processes that these drugs are addressing, they have a lingering effect. There's a washout effect that does occur. So you're not losing all hope, and you're not turning the disease back into an inferno of raging disease by having even a gap, because this disease works out over many months to years, not hours to days.
Yes, I definitely agree with Dr. Vierling's assessment as well. I would say, number one, we don't have any washout window that we recommend for patients who are going through the transition. They can stop one and start the other the next day. And number two, as Dr. Vierling mentioned, this is a slow progressing disease. It takes oftentimes years for the disease to progress. And for those who are currently on obeticholic acid, it is in good control, chances are it will also take months for this disease to progress. Therefore, we have that window of opportunity to start an alternative medication. And that gives us the time to do so in a careful and individualized manner.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Chiang. I believe the last question or one of the last questions. What are the worsening signs of liver function or liver disease that patients should be mindful of during the medication transition? I believe we would go back to the 3 S's that you had mentioned, Dr. Chiang, but if you'd like to chime in on that.
Sure. So I would say there are 2 aspects of symptoms that we can consider. One aspect of the symptoms are the symptoms of cholestasis or slow bile flow of the liver, which is the basic underlying disease process of PBC. And when you have slow bile flow, you may have symptoms that's related to the bile. And some of the patients may experience symptoms of pruritus, which is skin itch. Some of the patients may experience symptoms of jaundice, yellowness of the eye. The other would be as the disease progress into cirrhosis, then you may actually develop swelling of the belly. You may develop confusion that could be either memory loss, or you could develop bleeding that's a result of engorged blood vessels in the stomach or esophagus. So those are the symptoms that can result from cirrhosis. That's the more advanced form of PBC.
Anything you'd like to add, Dr. Vierling? I want to give you the opportunity to speak if you'd like.
No, I thoroughly agree with what Dr. Chiang had. And for many people, the benefit that they have achieved from having a combination of first-line UDCA therapy combined, in this case, with obeticholic acid has been that they have not progressed to cirrhosis. Those patients, because the progression would literally take multiple months, if not multiple years, is not something they should be worried about in the transition.
Very good. I think we've actually gone through and answered all the questions that were posed and were put up into the Q&A section. I would like to, as we are getting to our time, actually pretty much right on time, I would like to just thank the attendees. Thank you for everyone who was able to join. I know we've had people from around the United States and actually around the world on this webinar, which I am very excited about. Behalf of the Northeast Ohio Liver Alliance, as well as Carol Roberts with the PBCers organization in New York. I would like to thank the speakers, Dr. Chiang and Dr. Vierling, as well as Rachel Kilian from Intercept Pharmaceuticals for being an advocate, for being out there with patients and in front of people to be able to help with this transition. At this time, I think we're going to end. This webinar will be on the Northeast Ohio Liver Alliance's YouTube page, as well as the PBCers website. So thank you guys very much for attending. Thank you all for coming, for your time, for your generous efforts, and continuing to take care of the patients in the best way possible. Thank you all.